Buju, Wabanung Meshe Kiak Kiak Dijinakaz, Bawating Donjaba, Ajajak and Doodem, Anishinaabe Ojibway and Ao, Kitche Nemebene Zebing and Dading. My name is Marty Reinhardt. I work as a professor of Native American Studies at Northern Michigan University. And my family is from the Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan and Ontario area, a place we call Bawating, or Place of the Rapids. And we are Crane Clan Anishinaabe Ojibway. We're a mixed ancestry family. I actually have a biological family that's Irish American and adoptive family that's German American. My wife and two daughters and I, we live in a place that's known as Marquette, Michigan. Traditionally, the name is Kitche Nemebene Zebing, or Place of the Great Suckerfish River. I am pleased to be invited to this conference and to share my thoughts with you on Indigenous identity and food relations today. So one of the first things that the students in my classes, in Native American Studies classes, that they encounter in my classes is the Thomas Theorem. So this is an American sociologist from back in the 1920s. And W.I. Thomas said at that point in time, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So that's really important as we think about identity and our relationships with things that we call food. So first thing I'll talk about this evening is 3 ways of identifying Indigenous people. You heard me talk about biological and cultural families. There's a third dimension that we include when we're talking about identity with Indigenous peoples, and that's our legal and political dimension. I like to think of this as a hoop dance. The biological, the cultural, the legal, political, we see our individuals in the center of those rings, and all of these things are going on around them as they dance through life. So the chart you see on this next slide with all the numbers on it, it's actually a chart that comes from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for tribal enrollment. You may have heard in relationship to slavery and African American history, the 1 drop rule, where 1 drop of African blood made you eligible to be a slave. The reverse is true when it comes to American Indian people. We have the reverse 1 drop rule. 1 drop less of Indian blood makes you less of an Indian. You can never be fully Indian again. And of course, there are many implications that come along with that. It's a loss of rights. You become disenfranchised from programs, from your tribal community at times, from your citizenry. So there's a number of things that this policy of extermination has done to Indian communities and families. A biological identity is often thought of in that way, but it really comes down to genetic, phenotypic, and environmental factors. So people often think about Indian people as being born Indian. Or were you born an Indian person? Do you have Indian genes? You get half of your genes from your mother, half of your genes from your father's family. Now, if you have a parent, either your mother or your father, or both, are Indigenous people, then obviously you have genes from your Indigenous family. If you have genes from one and not the other, based on your genetic structure, you may have phenotypically not appear Indian. So the phenotype is the external expression of our genes. And so you, in fact, could be expressing your Indigenous parents' genes and not your non-Indigenous, or vice versa. And so the things that we historically think of as atypical for may be expressed. There's also the environment, sun tanning, windburn. Those are the kind of things that will impact the way you look. And there's also the epigenetic effect, the things that will impact your genes, like radiation from Hiroshima or Nagasaki or Chernobyl. So there's a number of things that we have to consider on a biological basis. What is culture? It was a second form and probably the most common form of identity we associate with Indigenous peoples. You know, the smudge there that someone is fanning with an eagle fan. Down in the lower left-hand corner, you see this is the Munising Children's Powwow. I'm the one on the right. I'm a traditional male dancer and a veteran. And so it's one of those things that I like to do when my arthritis allows me to do it. According to Merriam-Webster, culture is the integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends on the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. Major elements of culture include symbols, language, norms, values, and artifacts. We act on culture and culture acts on us. It's a dialectic relationship. There's that part that you see, and that's often what people see. They see our powwows, they might hear the language, if they're lucky, hear our music, see our videos, our comedies even, like Reservation Dogs on TV. But it's those things that go much deeper, the unseen culture, or what's considered deep culture, that people often don't see. On a legal and political identity level, we often talk about sovereignty, our citizenship, our rights. Our rights, our sovereignty, is inherited from our ancestors as Indigenous people. Our ancestors were here on Mother Earth, Turtle Island, the place that we call our home here on North America. And you heard me talk about what we call our places where we live or grew up. We think of this as Anishinaabe King, the Anishinaabe nation, our country, that was here and existed and still exists right to this day. Although we're in a colonial state, we wake up every day as colonized people. And so we coexist with this idea of the United States and Canada and Mexico. These are colonial states that have been stretched across our Indigenous homelands. Our citizenships then therefore extend, of course, from our tribal citizenship first and foremost. That was our original citizenship, through the process of treaty making and trust relationships. And I say trust in quotations because it isn't always very trustworthy. We became American citizens or Canadian citizens. And because of those processes, through treaties or subsequent legislation, we backed our way into state citizenry. So those states that hold their own sovereignty or provinces, we come to be part of those as well. We also have these new kind of tribes where we had our original tribal sovereignty, the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibway, Odawa, and Potawatomi. We now have this kind of new sovereignty, this new tribe that exists as federally recognized tribes or state recognized tribes. And so that's a little bit different when we're talking about the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians or the Navajo Nation. So it's a little bit different in our approach to our sovereignty and our citizenship. It's also about our rights. We have Aboriginal rights, we have treaty rights, and we have civil rights. Our Aboriginal rights, of course, are those that we retain from our true sovereignty through being tribal citizens, things that we've never given up. Treaty rights, of course, are attained through the treaty making process. And some of those are retained rights that we have put into treaty. We retain the right to this, to do this or that, like hunt, fish, gather, or spiritualize or educate or what have you. And then we have civil rights. And the civil rights may pertain to our civil rights within our tribe, but it also may be our rights within the United States or the states we live in. So we come at Indigenous identity in a few different ways. In this concentric circle model here, you can see that we think of it sometimes on a local or regional Indigenous level. And so, on a local or regional Indigenous level, for me, I exist within the center of Anishinaabe Ojibway. And so all the people who are citizens of tribes in the local community around me are the same as I am as far as their affiliation. Although we do have people who are not part of the local tribes who live here as well. And then, the idea of states. If we think about Michigan as the state in which I live, we often think about Michigan indigenous populations. We start defining ourselves in that way. I am the president of the Michigan Indian Education Council. And so you have this kind of state thinking about indigeneity. And of course, then you have national indigenous identity, like in the United States or Canada. And oftentimes we define ourselves that way. So you'll see the US Census data on indigenous people in the United States. In North America, we think about North American indigenous versus Central or South American indigenous oftentimes. Western Hemisphere, the Americas, right? We think about American indigenous foods. Some people, when they think of indigenous foods, they think of it as being from the Americas. So from north to south, as far as you can go. And then global indigenous, indigenous people from all around the world. It's, as we think about Aboriginal people in Australia, or Native Hawaiians, or Native people in Africa, or even in Europe, global indigenous people. We also think about it as tribal family groups. So we may have families who exist differently than the larger groups within the tribe. And so like my family, we think of ourselves as a tribal family group, and we have our own customs and traditions within our family. So we may do things differently than other tribal families. Then you have tribal community groups. And so within the communities, you have different traditions, like over in Sault Ste. Marie, there may be things that in that community that they do differently than Ojibway groups that are still part of the same tribe here in Marquette or down in the Escanaba area in the UP. And then you have the tribal cultural group. So on this map that you see on this slide, those red dots reflect Anishinaabe, the language of the Anishinaabe. Those are Anishinaabe speaking communities. And so those dots really represent a tribal cultural group spread if you measure it by language presence. And then you have also intertribal cultural groups, sometimes different tribes that are different cultures coming together to form whatever kind of intertribal relationship that they determine should be created. Although sometimes this is also created by other entities. For instance, the United States government put different tribal cultural groups together on reservations, like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, MHA Nation. And, why did they do that? Because it was convenient for the US government to do that. So sometimes you have different tribal cultural groups being put together to form intertribal groups, not of their own will. So there's a lot of things that we've been called, this pan-ethnic terminology: American Indian, Native American, Indigenous, Aboriginal, Tribal, First Nations. They're, the things that they have in common is what we've been called by others. And what we call ourselves is our traditional names. So when I identified as Anishinaabe Ojibway, that's what we call ourselves. There's a difference, right? So if we were to, for instance, talk about Europeans, that's a pan-ethnic term, whereas French people may say we are French, and Irish people may say we are Irish. And so there is this pan-ethnic terminology that's been used to talk about us as a group, as a homogenous group. I like to think of the things that we call Indian people as being rather ambiguous, including our own identities, our own traditional identities, because sometimes there is, sometimes we may say, I am Sault Ste. Marie, Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Sometimes I may say I'm Anishinaabe Ojibway. And really, what's the difference between those two is one is a traditional cultural name, one is a more contemporary Americanized or anglicized version of our names. And when ambiguity crops up in identity, it's really can be impactful on people understanding who we are in relationship to ourselves and others. By the way, I am heading to Las Vegas tomorrow for my nephew's wedding, so it's also very funny, the image on the slide, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So I was talking about how Anishinaabe could mean Ojibwe, Odawa, or Potawatomi, and you can see that even within the framework of our traditional terminology, we also have different spellings. We had, when we go from an oral tradition to a written tradition, we see different spellings. Ojibwe, W-A-Y, Ojibwe, W-E, Ojibwa, W-A, Chippewa, which is the anglicized version of Ojibwe. And then you have Odawa, Odawe, Ottawa, Potawatomi with an M-I and a P at the beginning, Bodwewatami, Potawatomi with a Y at the end. So there's a number of ways that our names have been spelled or misspelled over the years, coming from an oral tradition to a written tradition. And then you also see the contemporary versions of the federally recognized tribes, which even make it more confusing for folks trying to figure out who we are. Excuse me. A little bit dusty in here working on our concrete walls here today. Mino-Bimaadiz. This means essentially the good life when translated into English. This is our birthright. The good life is our birthright. This medicine wheel is how we symbolize the good life, and it's also a very basic teaching tool for our Anishinaabe traditions. I tell my students, imagine this as like a contact lens in front of your eyes or in front of your mind's eye, right? So you see life through this. It represents life cycles. You look at it in the eastern direction or the yellow direction, we call Wabanung, and then you go to the south, the red direction, in a clockwise way, Jawanung. That represents, so in the east, that represents the babies, and in the south, the adolescents. You then go to the west, that represents the middle agers, the Ingagbiaganung. That is also what we call the leadership generation. You go to the north, and that's the Kiwedanung. And that's our elders. That completes that cycle, that generation. And then we go back into that subsequent generation. So not only does it represent life cycles, it also represents spiraling through time and how we hand things down from generation to generation. This is our cultural transmission we spoke of earlier. It's also a way that we understand our spirit selves in relationship to other spirit beings. This circle represents us, and in the center of the circle is the perfect place of balance and harmony in nature. That's where we see ourselves in the most healthiest way, is that center of the circle. It's important that we try to maintain our balance and to be in that place. Although we realize that oftentimes we never really truly get to exist there for long. We always end up getting imbalanced and trying to get back to the center. And when we pass through it, it feels so good. We know that that's where we want to be. That's our optimal selves. Along with that, we're also given our 7 grandfather teachings. The 7 grandfathers include Miigwech or wisdom, Zagid love, Minaadendamo respect, Akadaea bravery, Gwekadze honesty, Debadendes humility, and all of those things together help us find Debwe the truth. We know that if we don't use all of those together, that we will end up dealing with their opposites. Instead of love, we'll find hate. Instead of respect, disrespect. We'll get a big head and let our egos take over if we don't follow our path to humility. So we know as humans that in the origins of the universe, that there are much older beings in the universe, all the way back to what we think of as Kichimanadu, the great spirit or greatest spirit. So if you think about that medicine wheel and you think of that medicine wheel as the great spirit, it's the everything, that circle that surrounds everything, both the known and the unknown. And so that's how we see that. The older, wiser beings originate from that original being. And from that original being comes original thought and all subsequent life. And so we see ourselves as the youngest of those beings, all those older and wiser beings that come before us. So it really makes us humble when you think of ourselves in relationship to the rest of what we think of as creation. Plants are called the first warriors. They were the ones who gave their lives up so that we could live. And so we think of them as, again, among those older, wiser beings and on those who we depend for our lives. Besides the medicine wheel and the 7 grandfathers, we are also taught about our Doodem responsibilities. We structure our relations around our responsibilities as members of our Doodems, or what people commonly call clans in English. These clans or Doodems are set up in a way that we always have checks and balances in our governance structure as Anishinaabe. You'll see that each of the Doodem figures are aligned in a triad if you look at the points of the star, the 7-pointed star there. So, for instance, the Loon clan and the Fish clan are aligned with the Crane clan. So every time you have this triad, it creates checks and balances in the system. The United States, the way they set up their government, oftentimes people are told that they modeled their government, their idea of governance structure anyway, after the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. And that is true. And like the Haudenosaunee, we had a similar structure of leadership for the Anishinaabe. Our 3 leadership clans are those ones I mentioned, the Crane, Loon, and Fish clan, often called Turtle clan. And so the United States adopted something similar to our 3 leadership clans. For our leadership, we have the Loon clan, which really deals with internal governance of our communities. Crane clan deal with external governance, so like ambassadors dealing with external relations. And Fish clan are the peacekeepers. If there was a conflict to arise between Crane and Loon, it is the Fish clan that would help us resolve those conflicts. We're taught that our first treaty was with the animal nations. I'm just going to read this to you, even though you can read it on the screen if you're able to see that. Burroughs explains that Jawengige is another derivation of Jawanim. It means to hunt. We hear the word used in hunting and harvesting songs. When we sing Jawanim Ojibway, it means you will be pitied or have mercy placed upon you in your actions and what you're doing. Jawanim Ojibway. The idea behind this word is that when we acknowledge our relationships with the world and our responsibilities to each other, then we'll all be blessed or find love and compassion. We'll be nourished, sustained, and taken care of. The idea of Jawengige is said to be part of an old treaty the Anishinaabe made with the animals. As long as we love them, they will provide for us and teach us about love and how to live well in the world. We also have treaties that we made between tribal nations. So the Anishinaabe people made treaties with other indigenous people before we made treaties with foreign nations. What you see in this image on the screen is from the Wampum Treaty of Peace with the Haudenosaunee, between Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe from 1701. This is called the dish with one spoon. And so it showed that we are all essentially locked into a relationship that we are mutually dependent on with the plants and animals and Mother Earth. And so that we know that we have similar responsibilities. We have a similar treaty with the Dakota or Lakota, Nakota from 1695. According to Ellen Ojig Corbier, wampum is a mnemonic device that's based in our oral practices, and this is something that had to be recited and renewed annually. So we would get together between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and the Dakota people on an annual basis to renew essentially our commitment to this treaty, to make sure that we had the best, the highest thought in mind when we were talking about how we interacted in the world and how that we were mutually dependent on those in order to survive and thrive in where we lived. This is one of my favorite images. It's from an 1849 petition based on the Treaty of La Pointe, 1842. And in this image, well, this image is based in birch bark. It was a birch bark scroll taken by Anishinaabe leaders to Washington, D.C. to petition the President of the United States about the terms of the treaty. And so in this birch bark scroll, you can see that there are lines that connect the different clan or Doodem beings. There are lines that connect the Dodems, their eyes or their brains, as well as their hearts. And so that's one of the things that we're taught, is to not just think with your brain, but to think with your heart, which is the center, our jit chug, where our spirit selves reside, where we dwell within. So we also recognize that we can't just intellectualize everything. We have to feel and think with our spirit being. The line also runs to Mother Earth and her non or more than human inhabitants. And so that is really important to recognize that that line also exists. And you'll also see that there's a line that goes off the page. And this line that goes off the page from the crane is the one that connects to the President of the United States. That is that clan responsibility to speak to the externals on behalf of our people. And so it really shows a lot of that understanding about our relationships with the world, with each other, with the plants and animals, and with external governments in this image. It's a really beautiful image. So I did some studies of treaties with the United States. because those treaty relationships have certainly been impactful on our ability to interact with plants and animals and other human beings regarding food. There are 295 treaties that were signed between tribes and the United States, including 734 articles within those treaties that are food related. There are primarily three categories, where those rights fall into place. 88 of those provisions are the rights to hunt, fish, and or gather. 204 provisions for goods, provisions, and subsistence. 186 for support for farming and milling. And then there's a combination or outliers that there's another 105 that may be somewhat related to food or a combination of these other ones. For the Anishinaabe, we have 52 treaties out of those 295 that have 107 articles in them, 25 provisions for rights to hunt, fish, and gather, 53 for goods, provisions, and subsistence, 60 for support or farming and milling, and 24 for other. So, how do we define indigenous foods? Well, we propose that we can define them in at least two important ways. One is in relationship to themselves. Indigenous foods or food beings are related to each other and have their traditional homelands. They've evolved through long-term adaptations to their surroundings. We also define them in relationship to indigenous peoples. We may have deep historical and shared spiritual connections to the foods through ancestral food experience. They are our cultural relatives, as I pointed out in this presentation, and part of indigenous peoples' traditional identities. We did a study called the Decolonizing Diet Project. Back in 2010, we began planning it, and we implemented it in 2012. So we defined our indigenous food base in a three-part manner. One was a cultural way that we defined it. We used Helen Hornbeck Tanner's Atlas of Great Lakes Indian History and used the principal theater from the atlas to define the area. The epicenter of the DDP was located in Kitche-Nime-B'nai Zebing, or Marquette, Michigan, shown by the red dot there. And it's interesting, too, that that's almost central to what we think of as Anishinaabe, a king. On an ecological level, we use the Great Lakes Water Basin, which is defined by all of the waterways that feed into the Great Lakes. We also use the height of the land and tributaries coming down from the height of the land. Finally, we expanded it a little bit further using a vernacular definition. We just literally asked people if they thought of themselves as living within the Great Lakes region. If you look at the image too, the map image, if you look at it from left to right, it kind of looks like a bear's head, which is kind of cool. You know, when we first drew it out, we didn't really notice it. And then someone said, hey, that kind of looks like a bear. So it's kind of cool because the bear is so important for Anishinaabe people. It represents medicine and health and protection. So we further defined our indigenous foods by a criteria based on colonization. And so in the Great Lakes region, we never really encountered non-indigenous people until around 1600. That's where we drew our arbitrary line then, is at 1600. And we defined everything that was previous to 1600 as what we would think of as native pre-colonials, or foods that were not introduced by humans deliberately or accidentally into the Great Lakes region, that they existed prior to European colonization of the region. We had introduced pre-colonials. These were foods that were introduced by indigenous people, by humans, deliberately or accidentally into the Great Lakes region and existed prior to European colonization. We also have derivations of both of the native pre-colonials and the introduced pre-colonials. And those are foods that, of course, have been derived from those original species. The foods that we deemed ineligible included the introduced colonials. These were foods that were introduced by humans deliberately or accidentally into the Great Lakes region after, or during, I should say, European colonization. Anything that has derived from those things that were introduced, during colonization are also ineligible. And then finally, anything that is genetically modified, including those things that were genetically modified from the introduced or native pre-colonials or their derivations. We developed a master food list, which we do maintain, and sometimes we will change based on the arguments that are presented to us about what should and should not be included in this food list. We did decide purposefully not to include things that are more medicinals, less edibles. And so, of course, that line is somewhat blurry sometimes because oftentimes they are both. Food is medicine, we know that. But we also did not want people to get hurt by running out and starting to eat some of these things without much education about them, because we know some of these things can be pretty harmful if utilized in the wrong way. Finally, this evening, I wanted to focus the last slide here on the idea of recentering our identity and our relations. The image on the far left represents what we would think of as the colors, the concentric circle colors of our medicine wheel. And we existed in a circular thought fashion. Our whole lives revolved around the circularity of living in our relationship with the rest of the universe. The middle image shows the colors of the United States in a triangle, and shows this hierarchical model, this colonial model that foregrounds our indigeneity. And so we've been existing within this colonial state of oppression for over 500 years now. And we are trying to decolonize. We are trying to revitalize our indigenous cultures, which seems rather radical to many people. For us, it's not radical, it's our lives. It's who we are, it's our basic identity and lifestyles. It's our who we identify as, even as we are existing in this colonial state. Finally, the image on the far right represents what may be the future, or the distant future. I don't know, we'll see what happens. And it's more of an amalgamation of those hierarchical image and the pre-colonial image. We've incorporated the colors of the United States, or I've incorporated the colors of the United States into 4 directions within the circle, because I do believe that there are good things that we have experienced, even though we've experienced them through colonization, the lens of colonization, we've still experienced some good things. I say that I would not want to live in a world that is devoid of Pink Floyd. I like Pink Floyd. I also like other things that have come to us from other cultures. You know, we don't exist in a vacuum as Indigenous people. We exist with others. And we have an idea, if we were given the opportunity, if we had been given the opportunity to encounter and engage with other cultural ideas, I'm sure we would have, our ancestors would have adopted some of these things into an Anishinaabe lifestyle. So I don't think we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we can recircularize our lifestyles. We can decolonize. We can revitalize. And I think when we do, we may find that we have incorporated, integrated some of these things that we've encountered over the last 500 years that may not have started out as Anishinaabe, but we certainly would think of them as something the Anishinaabe people would want today. So I think that is my vision for what may be off into the future for our descendants, our subsequent generations. And I think it could be a beautiful image as it's shown here. On say Miigwech, thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'm certainly willing to try to provide you an answer, time permitting, and see what I have in my head to share with you.
Thank you. That was great. One of the questions we have is, what is one of your favorite stories or cultural teachings?
Yeah, so I really like, we have this character that represents the human nature in our Anishinaabe oral tradition. And that character is known as Nanabuju, also called Wainabuju, or, different names throughout the thousands of years that these stories have been told and retold. One of my favorite teachings is the idea that when Nanabuju went out and learned the names of the plants and the animals, that was a part of Nanabuju's job. And so that story gets told and retold differently by whoever tells it. And I'm doing a terrible job of sharing it with you right now. But I'm also not necessarily in storytelling mode right now, so I'm kind of giving you the highlights, the Cliff Notes version of that story. But it's an important story nonetheless. And it represents, of course, that first encounter between what we would consider the human element and those plants and animals, and how we learned how to call them from them. Like, Carl Linnaeus went out and named the plants and animals, right? And so that was rather egocentric. Here's what you're going to be. Here's what you're going to be. And, it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with what the plants and animals were telling Carl, like they told Nanabuju. I think it'd be very interesting to have a story, a contemporary story, where Nanabuju and Carl Linnaeus talk to each other about, their way they approach the naming or, the learning the names of these plants and animals.
That's great. Yeah, that would be quite the event. Thank you for that imagery in my head too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What are some of the items that you ultimately removed from your master list of decolonized foods as a result of discussions or arguments that may or may not be ongoing?
Yeah, so, we haven't removed many, actually. We're open to removing them, but we were careful not to include some things on there that we said, okay, well, that could have been used as a spice, right? So, for instance, like bloodroot. Bloodroot's more of a medicine. And so I don't know that I would include it as a spice, even though it certainly does have a taste to it. All medicines do. But would we really want to include that as something that people are going to engage in that could hurt them, right? Especially, what if they go out and not only hurt them, but hurt the plants and animals, right? So we don't want everybody going out into the areas where these things grow and digging them all up. Those are special. And,
Yeah.
We can feed ourselves without having to go decimate a bog or go decimate a wetlands, trying to find these rare and unusual tastes. Our palates are just fine without having to eat everything. So it's not just for our protection, but it's also for the protection of these plants and animals.
Thanks. If you're just joining us on the live stream on the website, if you have any questions for Dr. Martin Reinhardt, feel free to pop them in the comments box below this video. Take a couple more minutes, and then I just wanted to reiterate my gratitude for you joining us tonight. The knowledge that you've shared, I learned a lot.
Is Jen froze up, or is it just me? Okay, Jen, you were appearing frozen on my screen there for a minute. I wasn't sure if it was your connection or mine.
I'm not sure. It just started raining here, so it could be mine.
Oh, okay.
I'm not seeing any other comments come in from the chat. Did you have any final statements or anything you wanted to say
Well,
before we send you on your way for the night?
I appreciate the invitation. Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, I really appreciate being invited, and I know I've been invited to present at this conference a number of times in the past, and it's just never worked out. So I'm so glad that it finally worked out. And it took COVID and Zoom to get me to finally be able to do this. Maybe one day when we're all back on site, and doing things together again soon, I hope, then we'll be able to do some more work on indigenous foods. And I just really look forward to those times. We do have an announcement. If anyone is interested in coming to the Build and Broaden Indigenous Agriculture and Food Sovereignty Symposium that Northern Michigan University is partnered with the Anishinaabe Indian community, the Intertribal Agricultural Council, Michigan State University Extension, Ferris State University, and Michigan Tech, among others. We have a number of co-sponsors. We will be on May 20th up at the Anishinaabe Indian community for a day, and then at Northern Michigan University in Marquette on the 21st and 22nd. So be looking for that. Go to food-sovereignty.com to register and find out more information.
Beautiful. Thank you. We'll make sure to post that and show that resource. And again, Miigwech for joining us. Bamapi.
Bama.